many of you know you should be reading more books, but for some reason, you just don't have the time? There's nothing like reading to become a more knowledgeable version of you. That's where the Blinkist app comes in. Blinkist takes top nonfiction titles and puts them into 15-minute text and audio explainers called Blinks. Use Blinks to learn more about topics, say philosophy. Maybe you're into history. You could look into science. You could dive deep into psychology, health and nutrition, or personal growth. You've got thousands of titles in 27 categories of the world's best knowledge to choose from. Blinkist gives you the knowledge you need in the time you actually have. I love Blinkist. In just 15 minutes driving in the car, I can absorb an entire book's worth of knowledge. This morning, on the way to the studio, I listened to What They Don't Teach You at Harvard Business School. The first 100 people to go to Blinkist.com/Chael are going to receive unlimited access for 1 week to try it out. You'll also get 25% off when you sign up for a full membership. Guys, that's Blinkist.com/Chael. Do it right now to get this offer. Khabib was doing an interview and he was talking about Conor. Khabib just had an observation that I think is very obvious, but nobody said it before until Khabib said it. And the statement was simply, Conor will never be able to kick the same again with that leg. Now, while that's very obvious, it's still very interesting to me. It's interesting for a couple of reasons, because does it matter? Conor has some good kicks, but he doesn't have an extremely kick-heavy game, just by example. But moreover, for anybody, I realize there's exceptions to this, okay? You have Edson Barboza, who I believe is the best, fastest, most vicious kicker that I've ever seen. You have Edson Barboza. If you took kicks away, that is going to change and greatly take strategies and tools out of the chess. For most other guys, there's risks in taking kick, and there isn't a huge reward. There's really not. Kickboxing, by example, which meant you can kick and you can box, right? Pretty straightforward, right there within the title of the sport. But around 1983, they had to put a new rule in place because guys weren't throwing kicks. You're having kickboxing, but the guys that are winning the fights and doing well are coming out and they're only boxing. They're not throwing any kicks. So kickboxing had to put a rule in that you must throw 3 meaningful kicks per round or you lose a point. Now, there's a real lesson in that. When the kickboxers weren't even kicking, not because it's not an effective tool, by the way. Like you always meet people like, oh, what's he talking about? Let me kick him in the leg. I'm not saying you can't generate some real force and some real power, particularly that could add up and be accumulative. But I will tell you the history of combat, most of the better work is done and the more powerful things are done with your hands. That's a reality. Then you would probably start to look at elbows and knees you'd put in the same category, and then you would get to kicks. It's definitely effective. It's definitely on the list. Not attempting to dismiss it. Practice kicks every day of my life. Work on them with my son, still to this day. But in all fairness, if Conor could never kick the same again, was he some kind of a good kicker in the first place? Is there a fight that you can turn to that he kicks somebody and that major weapon, right? Just one of those things where why can't you change the rules of the sport? What kind of an attitude is that? I've never really liked that, but I was a wrestler. I grew up, I watched guys. Dave Zuniga comes to mind. NCAA finalist, ends up hurting his knee, so he's having a hard time just with the stance and position of wrestling, bending over, bending his knees, but now he's got this ACL. He just switches sports, goes right into Greco-Roman wrestling, which is from an upright posture, leave the legs out completely, goes and makes an Olympic team. And just by example, it would seem as though the greats could always adapt to any one rule change that there needed to be. I mean, even right now, I think it's New Jersey, doesn't have the same elbow rule that all other 49 states have. I believe it's the elbow where you can't do elbows at all in New Jersey. At least that was once true. There was no fighter that said, hey, let me fight, but don't send me to New Jersey. You just don't throw the damn elbows. Why? Because it was the rule. What's the difference? Okay, he can't throw that same kick anymore. Why? Because it could break his leg. And some guys deal with it different. One of the great PR ever for an injury was done by Tim Sylvia. Tim breaks his arm, breaks his forearm. They put a metal plate in it to bring things back together. And Tim started doing interviews about it. He was saying that he was beeping as he'd go through at the airport, going through the security, and he's going to get in there, and they're going to sign off on it, and it's within the rules, and he's going to smash that plate right into his opponent's head. I mean, Tim just steered right into it. Tim didn't give a damn. But it was great. This was back in 2002. I still remember the way that Tim Sylvia dealt with it because he dealt with it so well. So there's just so many bigger problems with McGregor, right? There's just bigger problems with this sport, and you'll never be done with this sport. You'll never be done being an athlete. But every athlete one day will wake up and the sport is done with you. It's the way it goes. It's a very cold cycle, but you saw the ride. You bought a ticket anyway, including Conor. Conor's done this to other people and sent them out the door. He's taken the belt off of their waist. He's taken spots from them. Like Nate Diaz said, you took everything I've ever worked for. It's cold. Conor didn't do anything wrong. Now he's having it done back to him. I only suggest this for you because there's a lot bigger problems here. And if we as a community don't support him right now to get that rehab, get the motivation, keep life mentally and physically on track for one of our own, we're failing. Once we get there, if we as a community pressure or even encourage him to get back in the cage, that's a fail. There was nothing within that contest. There was no spot. There was no position that resembled what Conor had used to look like. And I'm not giving him a hard time. I'm actually attempting to make a different point, which is only that all had to do with inactivity, but not just from competition, also within the gym. And at that time, it was a choice. He had the choice. Do I go to practice? Do I go to the bar? He could have done either. He does not have the choice now. It has to be the either. And doctors were coming out today and saying it would be a year for Conor to be back, which I think is what we would guess because that's right in line with what Anderson Silva went through. That's right in line with what Chris Weidman was told he's going to go through. That seems like it's very reasonable. That's a long time. A year away from training, away from the sport. I mean, the regression would be huge. You could go through a full training camp to get back to in a youthful time how you would enter training camp. I had to do that towards the end of my career, where I had to train to be ready to go into training. It just did. It was just a little bit harder to keep your shape, a little bit harder to get there, just be able to eat anything I wanted. All of a sudden, I'm having to pay attention to some nutrition. It just comes with age. You guys might have been through it, or you will at some point. But I had to train just to be able to go in to train. And that's the spot that Conor's going to be in. If he takes a year, and then what? They go, okay, you're ready, and he's chomping at the bit. Let's give him a fight in 6 months. A fight in 6 months after you sat for a year? Not to mention whatever you were doing to occupy your time. It's a guy that owned a whiskey company. I mean, in all fairness, it's going to take a meaningful amount of time, and then he's got to come back into a main event spot. He's just paid too damn much money. He's got to be a marquee guy. You're talking about 25 minutes. And who's he going to do it with? And we're going to nurse him and rehab him back into condition to go in and get stomped out by Dustin again? 2 of those judges had it 10-8. All 3 should have had it 10-8. Which constitutes 2 completed rounds in the last year, neither of which he won. It's just one of those spots. It's one of those spots. Let's encourage him. Let's get him through the rehab. Let's make sure there's some kind of a positive vibe. But secretly, we have to know. Once we get him back, we're not putting him in there again, are we?